and welcome to another Skillsminer podcast. And today, Kirsty and I are delighted to be joined by Dr. Sarah Babb, who's the MD of STEM and is coming at the skills world from a neurodiversity perspective. So welcome, Sarah, and welcome to join us today.
Thank you so much. So good to be with you and have this conversation.
I know it's been really exciting as we think about how organisations shape and move towards the future. How on earth did you get started on this journey and tell us all about you?
Oh my gosh, I think this journey has started many years ago when in South Africa we're transforming our education and training systems. So I got very involved with skills development 20 years ago when we were thinking about how do we build a skills development system that can be inclusive of people that perhaps didn't have or weren't advantaged in their education and didn't have access because of apartheid to qualifications. So 20 years ago, we were thinking of things like recognition of prior learning, where you could recognize skills, give people access to work. We had learnerships or work integrated programs where you could then gain access to work and through that get experience and a qualification, but at the end not be disadvantaged because you didn't have a qualification behind your name, that in fact you might have had capabilities and strengths that went unnoticed. So it was a very exciting time. I ran a business then called the Skills Framework for 10 years, and we worked on big national programs, big skills development initiatives. And for me then in certainly beginning to say, but is this developing enough? I started to become curious. Is this developing skills enough for the future? And then about 15 years ago, started working with futures thinking and scenarios development. And equally as exciting to say, what skills do we need for the future? What does our future look like? How will this unfold? But then my frustration came in saying, but now my time horizon for change is 15 years, 20 years. What do we need to do now to start developing those skills? And that's where my curiosity became, when I did see change happen, and so I was involved with change leadership, was when a leader in an organization took the initiative forward to say, we will be creating systems, we'll be creating policies, we'll be creating ways of bringing in the best people that can take our future organizations into the future, to be collaborative, human-centric, innovative, productive. But I still saw there was a disjuncture between the intention of where organizations see they need to have dynamic capabilities moving to the forward and the actual lived reality of silos, of long change cycles, of lack of a flexibility. And so there I was saying, but what are we missing? We're missing out on the unseen diversities, our thinking brains. If we had a safe environment, a safe culture that was inclusive, we would be bringing in the best of our thinking, the best of our humanity. And that took me to neurodiversity, which is a way of our brain being wired that is part of the human variation that we need, that diversity of thinking to be innovative, to be sustainable into the future.
That's incredible. What a journey. Can you tell us, and there may be some people that are listening right now, a little bit more about what neurodiversity really means and explain that to people in a little bit more as you understand it?
I was actually talking to a neuropsychologist this morning about the very thing. And the interesting thing about the term neurodiversity is actually it's a social movement term that Judy Singer brought into play as a social activist, saying we're thinking too much in dichotomies. We're thinking of differently wired brains as a medical deficit. Actually, what we should be using is the phrase neurodiversity. So it's a relatively new term. But I like the definition from Professor Fung of Stanford. He has a Center of Neurodiversity there. And he uses, essentially, he's saying that neurodiversity is a diversity of thinking, which is part of the normal variation of human brain functioning. Within, if we think we're all different, and in fact, this neuropsychologist said this morning, if you have twins that are identical in a family, even then you accept that they are different, even if their genes are matched, right? So every person is different and we all think differently, and this is a beautiful thing. But within that spectrum, there is 15 to 20% of our population that would fall broadly into neurodivergence. And within that includes ADHD, dyslexia, autism, and a whole range of behavioral traits and brain functioning that can be very broadly categorized. It's very complex and overlapping and comorbidities, and we're learning more with neuroscience and neuropsychology actually what some of the genetic links are and what the different behavioral patterns are. But if you think of it, it is really around how our brain has functioned, and there are broad categories one can look at from a strengths-based point of view. If you think of somebody with, when we get over our own stigma and bias that popular movies are bringing to us, like we all know Rain Man or Love on the Spectrum or The Good Doctor, it paints still quite a stereotypical view of what this means. But if we took a perspective of a strengths-based approach, we might be saying, if you look at ADHD, the way of thinking is extraordinary in terms of systems thinking, creative thinking, joining the dots, higher risk appetite. In fact, some of the research coming out of the UK is saying that in one sample, 40% they found of entrepreneurs are ADHD. It makes sense because, they're fired by novelty with a lower dopamine, are fired by novelty, innovation, passion, hyper focus on areas of interest. So there are great strengths behind that. Some are on a spiky profile. Some of the lower capacities are things like executive functioning. So you see, for example, people on the spectrum, autism spectrum, you might have a super bright professor, engineer, or even an IT specialist that can focus and be brilliant in their field and their data, but forgets where they put their keys. So there's this sort of scatty professor stereotype too. So a whole range of areas that I could talk more of, but in the general understanding, moving away from the thinking of a medical deficit, it's not an illness to be fixed. It's still classified as a disability, but like any disability, even physical, with small accommodations, can really support a neurodiverse brain to function at its best if it's in a safe and well-matched environment.
That's incredible. And I think that this is really interesting in terms of the kind of environments that we're creating inside our own organisations that allow people to come together to work in this way. I know everybody's kind of gone very agentic mad at the moment, chasing after all the shiny AI tools. But I'm more fascinated about where those things kind of come together and where they augment and grow the organisation, and that even at human level first is really quite interesting. Is there any examples that you can give us inside organisations, or where organisations have leaned into that and it's been successful? Sarah, I maybe come across 1% of like chief execs that are like really talking about their teams that are the most diverse in thinking, or they're international even, they're coming from different cultures. That creates greater impact or productivity. The measurements around about it is what fascinates me. Where's the data to give that kind of so I'm just really curious about where are you seeing this in its brilliance, who's picking up on this and doing great things with it?
I mean, firstly, just to concur that, the research is absolutely clear that diverse thinking brings about greater innovation, productivity, less groupthink. And we can talk about creating neuro-inclusive cultures that are safe. From a company perspective, I've seen there are 3 responses on a spectrum again. On the first level, many companies would say they've got basic accommodations for the individual that discloses. They're treated on an individual case-by-case basis, which is the minimal response by any stretch of imagination. Through to an approach where companies say we're going to have projects that really draw on this amazing diversity of neurodiversity. So companies like Ernst & Young have set up 23 neurodiversity centers of excellence where they bring these brains together to focus on solving, it might be IT issues or other challenges, and they're reporting 1.2 to 1.4% improvement in productivity, quality, and timeliness of output. They're reporting a 1 billion value creation from these centers of excellence. From really applying this thinking, matching the skills. And what's even more interesting, and you'll know this more than me, is the level of turnover of those high-level skills that you want is very high because of demand for talent, shortage of talent across the world. They're reporting a 92% retention rate of that neurodiversity talent.
Wow, that's brilliant.
And I think there are a few reasons for that. But then you even have JP Morgan Chase, for example, that's reporting 48% faster productivity, 92% up Companies like SAP have an autism at work program. They also report great IBM, Hewlett Packard, Deloitte, Microsoft, Apple, Wells Fargo, Dell have got employee resource groups. They really focus on this talent.
That's really interesting that a lot of those are in the technology space as well,
I was
Sarah.
going to
That's
say,
interesting.
yeah.
And banking and financial, I think, is also because of the high end of digital transformation in those sectors. So I was also challenged yesterday to say I shouldn't say IT sector because every business has IT now backing
IT, of
it, right?
course.
So it's like, so I do think there are other examples that maybe aren't reporting. I think where the big shift is to, if we move further along to the third level of that spectrum, and that's where organizations are doing what Kirsty, what you were saying, is building more inclusive cultures that
Yes.
are inclusive of diversity, of all kinds of diversity. And I think that would be the maturity of organizations that would see the more generic returns of that diversity. And the criteria there being, as you say, that leadership buy into this, that they have safe working environments where individuals can disclose, they can give ideas, they can challenge thinking, that there's this dynamic culture of innovation and change. And there it might not be reported as neurodiversity, but certainly there'd be a culture where that would be a norm rather than
more
a
accepting,
specific
yes.
reporting.
And they're big organisations, so it's fair to say in the beginning they probably had enough resources to go and test, validate, experiment to see how this kind of worked within their organisations. But as that data's shared and the stories around about what's worked and why this is good for business, it's that trickle effect into other sectors and other organisations and maybe slightly smaller organisations. Is there any sort of top tips that you could give SMEs or like not just the knowledge working environments that how could they get started on making a difference inside their organisation today?
So the suggestion being that firstly you look at understanding what skills you need and that your recruitment and attraction process is allowing for all diversities so that there isn't an exclusion even at the beginning of the process. Because already we're finding that even very skilled neurodiverse talent is excluded because of bias even at the entry point. So really just to look at, do you need an interview? Is it really important that you have an interview? Could a person pre-record? There's great success even using tech with pre-recording of interviews, sending the interview questions ahead, making sure your assessment tools are appropriate for the skills that you're actually looking for. And that's also where I think Skillsminer adds value. But then when you're managing people, making sure your managers are making the best of that diversity. So albeit physical, neurological, just thinking, different capacities, different learning abilities, whatever that is, to make sure your team is really creating a learning environment that can constantly innovate and stretch and grow. So the management capacity, your policies and procedures, I think is a good start. So your entry and then your management of your employees. And there can be other support and there's many toolkits one can get, but you want to make sure there's reasonable accommodations that aren't all that expensive. Example, noise cancelling headphones. Do you have flexible work? This is why you say it's an operating model, a way of working that allows for some flexible work times. Perhaps your person on the spectrum can hyper focus and get through the amount of work in one day that maybe another person takes a week, but by the fourth day they may be pretty overwhelmed. So is there flexibility? And this applies to everybody, right? Different people's sleep preferences. Some are better at night, some are better at morning. So do we have human capital practices that allow for that flexibility and basic accommodations? I was with an insurance company and I was horrified how they have an open plan office and you have to book for your desk. Everybody from executive to, but now what does that mean for the neurodiverse person with poor executive functioning? Number one, they'll forget to book the desk. So number two, they'll get the desk next to the photocopier and the door and the kitchen and too noisy. Right? So how hard is it to actually just book a desk for that person? So for the small company, it's not about a big investment. It's about awareness and intention to create an environment where everybody can thrive, really, and bring their best capability to work. That's what everybody wants. You know that Gallup, and it's even rising, reports that 62% of every workforce globally on average is disengaged. I I mean, that to me is like,
huge
how
number,
can
isn't
you
it?
go to work? How can you be at work and disengage 62% of your workforce? It breaks my heart, quite frankly. Really, creating an environment and where a manager respects and can draw in the best of a person relates to everybody, whether they're neurodiverse or not. And that would be a good starting point.
I think that that's really important, that engaged employee.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a shift, isn't there, in transformation activities. We're in a funny place right now, I think, in terms of culture, people and culture. And we've
Yes.
had things like the return to work, return to the office. You know, post-COVID, there's been quite a lot of change in this space, hasn't there? Where people have thought, organisations might think, this is too demanding on me. I only want people to turn up and do their job. But then they're not going to be able to be those engaged employees that they actually want to get.
Mm.
So this employee experience challenge is quite a big and meaty problem for organizations to really get a hold of in terms of thinking about their retention, their engagement, best productivity, and so on.
And especially since we're in an era of change, that we will be restructuring, there'll be new products, new services, and at a rapid pace. So if you have a disengaged employee, the likelihood of them adopting that change is going to be lessened, and the cost of turnover is very high. So it's also interesting in terms of the era of AI and the jobs that are coming. When you look at, I was listening to a World Economic Forum panel discussion, and they were talking about really the skills that we need in our people are the interpersonal skills, are the ability to collaborate, the ability to work with other humans, the ability to, no matter what tech can do, how do we bring people together to deliver, to sell to market with, to develop with, to create with, and those are all human capacities. And so again, if we're not bringing the best of people, the willingness to care, for example, or the willingness to create or the willingness to stretch will be reduced even more.
Yeah, that's quite interesting as well, isn't it? Because obviously, I mean, we're hearing this as well from clients and other businesses that we work with, that this transformation demand, this understanding of the workforce plan is really important. Now, what do I have to do? What's coming? What can I automate? What's going to be human? How do I make the most of this? And that's a challenging place to be for a people leader, Sarah, isn't it? In terms of the people leadership, and also it's no longer, a bit like you said, that the tech companies aren't tech companies because we're all powered by tech. We're all powered by people as well. So that role of understanding what you can do to get your business delivering really well, what inclusion practices you need to involve people, to get that engagement, that no longer is part of HR or people or culture. It's everybody's responsibility to do that. Are you seeing that kind of change as well in industry?
It's that having a sort of deja vu moment, because I think that's always the constant cry that management is the responsibility of everybody, not just, HR or other functions. So I think there's a greater awareness of the need for everybody to be growing the culture, because they're seeing it not necessarily going the way that it is. We had a panel last week which I hosted to discuss some of these questions, and we had the SAP HR director for Africa, and she was asked a similar question, and she was saying, we don't know what skills we'll need. How do we know? Which was quite, so this is somebody in the tech industry in a key role saying that we don't know. So our job is to stay attuned, to be sensing, and to have systems that can adjust quick enough to preempt and to allow people to know and bring them opportunities to learn. An interesting another thought is how the role of the Chief Technology Officer and the Chief HR Officers are becoming much closer. And how do we capitalize on all our capability in a business? So be it the tech skills with the people skills. Right down to an example of when I was talking yesterday to a chartered accountant in training. He's got his last stretch to do. And he was saying, why do I need to do this leadership course? It's wasting my time. I've got to pass my board. I'm working on that. So I said, well, what are you studying in this stretch of your qualification? And he said, we're learning about interpersonal skills and soft skills. So I just laughed. I was like, wow, okay, so even in your world, you're distinguishing the technical skills and the soft skills, but didn't draw the link with my responsibility. Yeah, so actually your role now is not to do not to do the repetitive task and the spreadsheet and the forecasting and the budgeting, because that's digitally enabled now. So the back end function of finance will be digitally enabled. But your job is now to partner with the business to help make better business decisions based on the financial insight and analysis that you glean from what the data is giving you. So I think definitely the not knowing what, but finding a way to stay in tune with what's needed and be building those capacities that can be translated quickly into our businesses is so important.
I think that's it's incredible, because we've, like, AI's the disruptor in a lot of organisations, or as fast will disrupt the types of skills that we need inside our organisations. But rethinking what skills will become is it's creative, it's human, it's part of imagination, and these are the things that I am seeing more and more inside. It's not just about the tools that they use, but it's about those human skills that will allow them to remain agile, to stay ahead, to create, to invent new things all the time. Those businesses that live in that space, or can or facilitate that kind of thinking, are the ones that will evolve faster and will fundamentally go on to use tools in a different way, like the AI tools that we have and things. But it's really incredible that you're in the engine room of that, Sarah, and I think that's what we found really fascinating about speaking to you over the last kind of couple of months and things, is that you're really working with them as they go through that change and that transition, and how they think about embedding it operationally as well. Fascinating, really, really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely, it's a part of a systemic operational change and way of working. It's a culture change which impacts the way of leading businesses. And then if you're laying that foundation, then it enables individuals and teams to thrive. But for me, the frustration has often been that you need both. You need both the flexible systems and structures and processes. And the human capacity. So absolutely, as you're saying, helping individuals and organizations partner better in this transition, because we're all learning and we're all looking at how this might unfold.
And that's the other thing that certainly Dinah and I have discovered, and we've known this for time immemorial anyway through digital transformation. It is about taking humans on that journey with us, so that has to be human centric, and it's lovely that still is the case in lots of ways as well.
I think you'll get to a point where, I suppose, it always comes down to a commercial decision, doesn't it, Sarah? So it's really great that you're saying this: percentages of retention, percentages of productivity, those kind of stats will always come in helpful. They will always be helpful to organizations who maybe don't value things in the same way, or will come down to that financial decision. But actually, how humans do add value is really important to them. Yeah. And it's quantifiable.
Exactly. The other thought is that, so from a neurodiversity point of view, if it is that and we do need more research, but if it is that 15 to 20%, that's of your current workforce already. So it's not just your future workforce. So I was speaking to a chief human resources officer in the motor industry, and she prides herself in creating a culture that is open and human centric. But even then she had cause to pause, because she said, we only have 2% that have disclosed a neurodiversity. That means that there's another 13 plus that haven't. So what else can we be doing to build an environment? And this is in a sort of motor industry, which is traditionally quite non-people centric, or becoming more and more automated.
Yes.
So yes, I think there is that sense of how do we change the culture and work with people to actually build these dynamic organizations that can sustain in the future.
And what sort of typical barriers would there be for people in organizations like that, Sarah?
For neurodiversity?
Barriers for neurodiversity, or barriers generally, yes. What's stopping that change, do you think?
So it would be interesting to hear your thoughts too, but I think there's a few things. So the one is the legacy systems and the legacy structures are very embedded. We hear of transformation, but that often means retrenchment, as opposed to restructuring a work process to be truly integrated or cross-functional and still remains very siloed. So one of the banks at the moment is literally restructuring around cross-functional teams to serve their customer with the multiple services, which you think, wow, that makes sense from a customer point of view, because we know how
Yes.
frustrating it is when we get sent from one department to the other. But it's taken how many years to get there? So obviously that requires digital, and with digital enablement, they can do that because there's one central record base of the customer.
Right.
Yes.
So I think there's that. I think there's also the capacity of leaders that, as you say, are so stretched in terms of we've now got global tariff changes, we've got the climate crisis, we've got legislative changes, geopolitical issues emerging, markets changing, China and the East growing. What does that mean in terms of strategy and
Every
focus?
day,
It's hugely
yes.
stressful for every leader to deliver to shareholders and stakeholders. So there is that, what do we prioritize? But for those that then have made the shift, there is a top-down commitment in terms of structurally and culturally, we commit to a human-centric, collaborative, innovative learning dynamic, and then creating the human capital systems and processes that fit that. The difficulty then is that the high performers don't always fit that. So part of that transition is how do we attract the right skills and talent towards the future, and how do we actually make firm decisions for those that don't fit in, so we can be living what we promise. And then, of course, you've got the other systems of reward and recognition and performance management that are still based on old KPIs or individual delivery, as opposed to supporting the broader speak. So a lot of it's also capacity building. So are we training in the new future skills that we need, not just AI, but in terms of people skills? So like training these CAs in collaborating with customers was a bigger skill than they realized they needed, just by way of example.
That's really interesting, actually. So it's that sort of, those superhuman elements can even be even more human. How, that needs development, that needs more growth, that needs more investment, more time to look at that. And I think that's probably a challenge when people are thinking about, okay, how do we automate? Like in businesses that we're speaking to, how do I automate? What do we do with AI? That investment back into, and what do I do to make my humans the superhumans with their skills, to give them the uplift that takes us. That's the balance for them, to look at those two different sides of it, really. And my concern would be that they just look at the automation and they're not thinking about the other side of it at all.
I've seen that too much. Working with the people side of change in businesses, that's definitely been a big insight. Yes, you might be forced to use that system, but you're not necessarily then getting the best out of the human in terms of their client delivery, internal collaboration, problem solving, innovation, stretching the boundaries, etc. And how funny how to be thinking about training our humans to be more human, because we've sort of lost this capacity.
And
yeah.
How we're trying to say that becomes the real defensible moat that you have. That's what's going to differentiate you from this other business that's using exactly the same tools. So I think that's the exciting part. I think that well, maybe where businesses find themselves in, they have the capability to go build that future. But it's true what you say. We've got to lay down the foundations. Another thing that kind of crossed my mind: do you think there's still a stigma about neurodiversity in the workplace? And what about assessment? I think that's something in the UK. There's huge waiting lists for people who don't quite know what's going on. They maybe want to speak to a psychiatrist but can't get access to the right kind of support. Where does this begin and end for people, not just organisations, I guess?
So absolutely, this stems from the notion that there's a medical diagnosis or a psychological or psychiatric assessment that's needed before there's a diagnosis. And the waiting lists, I believe, are enormous. So there are self-assessments one can do. There are other ways you can work with people that are not in the UK online for assessments. For example, this neuropsychologist this morning at a fraction of the price because he believes it's too expensive, the diagnosis, and is outdated, for example. So there's a whole discussion around diagnosis. There's more self-diagnosis amongst the younger generation coming into the workforce that are more comfortable self-diagnosing their identity in different ways. So I think there's a lot more of that coming through. But sometimes our legislation still requires that there's an official stamp from a medical practitioner to say that this is the case. So I think there's some systemic questions also around the DSM, which is used as the sort of the definition for diagnostics as well. But be it as that may be, one needs to look at the workplaces. What is the appetite for self-disclosure, even if you're
Yeah.
diagnosed or
Yes.
not? So there's legislative, whether it's official or whether you can be counted as it's still a disability in terms of a definition, which is also debatable. But when it comes to us looking at the workplace, it's really one wants a environment where self-disclosure is a norm and that we're normalizing conversations. And then that opens up place for even the existing leaders to be ambassadors and to build allyship. There's also a higher prevalence, by the way, of older women, and I mean older, I count myself in that category, being diagnosed. Also neurodiverse. Why? Because now their children are being more accommodated and diagnosed at school, and it's genetic. So they go, oh my gosh, where did they get that from? I see the behavior. Also, post COVID, the ability to mask, because women mask, and the
Yes.
diagnosis only in the last decade has become to bring in gender realization that ADHD, for example, presents very differently for boys and girls. So older women are being diagnosed more too. So that means many at the peak of their careers or in senior positions are now discovering that they are, and are actually quite relieved to be saying, no, I know why I didn't feel like I fit in, or I thought differently, etc.
Yes.
So again, what do we do with those people? Do we want an environment where there can be role modeling, disclosure, communities of support, and offer the correct support services to those people? Just by another example, I was actually in touch with some coaches that were working with a hedge fund management organization in London, and they were going, we can see the behavioral traits, there's a higher prevalence in that function of neurodiversity. What should we do? So we had a conversation around that, and we discovered, for example, as I said, the spiky profile. So on the spectrum, amazing with data, huge analysis, very successful hedge fund managers, but the executive functioning was lower, which meant they weren't good at time keeping. But the human capital team didn't understand this lens. So they were just wanting to send all these hedge fund managers to time management programs. Can you imagine the response that these hugely wealthful, successful, Wall Street type would go on?
In the first place.
So it just shows again, we want that environment where we understand, and it's, this is not it's not that it's not there. It's how are we helping ourselves understand and educate. And I think diagnosis is useful. People say, oh, we don't label, but it's not about labeling. It's about understanding. That's why your culture now has a problem with time management, because you have such a higher prevalence. So imagine the solutions would be very different then in building a way of working that accommodates that potentially, or just works or enables it. Exactly.
Yes, there was another fantastic study, years old now. It's about hiring the opposites of what we are, so that there's a fuller augmented team. Hiring to complement or to work in these kind of blended roles and things like that. I love that piece of research years ago that came out, and some people were experimenting with different shape profiles and things like you're talking about, Sarah. But what's your polar opposite? How do we find that in teams to create teams? So if one person's really great at doing this, who else is complementing and doing all the other things that the other person really hates doing,
Exactly.
They're really high functioning teams, so it's an interesting piece of work. But maybe the hedge fund managers should chase after that piece of research too.
Yeah, absolutely. And imagine those people that would love organizing and being executive assistants are amazing at that, and it's their strength and they can thrive in it. Not mine, I might add.
No, nor mine. I was just thinking I would really like that, actually.
But that is about it is about those, it's the square peg in the round hole type situation, isn't it, really? I guess that you're saying these are the things you're really brilliant at. And rather than us focusing on giving you more opportunity to be even more brilliant at those really brilliant things, we're saying, but you don't do these things over here very well. And we have a sort of deficit lens, don't we, as humans?
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
like, well, what didn't we do? What didn't we achieve? What didn't happen? What aren't you doing? And that can become the lens for leaders and managers to look at individuals and think, well, they didn't do, they were late for work, but they made millions of pounds, but they were late for work.
Exactly.
how are we looking at these two things as the same thing? So there's a massive
Yeah.
change culturally, like you're saying, with all of the responses in the systems and the capabilities that you have about working with your workforce, to change the way we look at problems like that, to bring in some systems thinking and step away from some of this rigidity, I guess.
And we have all the technology to help us to have more flexible work practices, to have hyper individualized approaches to human capital, to have ways of tracking the skills, for example, like with Skillsminer, that so everything is there, but it takes, as we said, the mindset, the leadership, the culture to say, it doesn't matter if you come in at 10 and the other person comes in at 3 if you're meeting your outputs, and doing it in a way that is conducive to the organization culture and way of working, our values. So you're not just detracting from those. But yes, definitely, it's a bit confounding that we aren't working. And there are the organizations that have worked on a strengths-based approach see that, where you allow people to thrive in a way that they bring their best forward.
Yeah, that's a really great. It's a nice opportunity. I would hope that as we move forward, there's more opportunity opening up for people in this way, so that we are less likely to try and box people into certain, places, and we're there to say, well, a recognition of that and opening opportunity and opening up more potential to recognize that where that neurodiversity can help organizations, where it can add value, where it supports that person or teams or other people. I think it's definitely a tricky place for people to be in and to understand. But I do think that as we progress, there's more about that systems thinking, there's more about that using of data and technology to help people to do that. Sarah, are you seeing more of a change in that space? Is it feeling like there is a movement in that direction?
I think there is a move. I work with Thompson Harrison, who also work with the Thrive model, and they talk to purpose-driven organizations and belonging, and definitely with the poorer levels of wellness of the newer generation looking for purpose, of organizations seeking or looking at what is their reason to be, can they survive? I think there are, and amongst the more mature leaders, there is a quest to say, how can we really embed this in human-centered, inclusive organizations, and are working hard to do that. It is a longer change, I think, because of the legacy and structures and silos and hierarchies and power dynamics and multi-generational forces in one place, and with the pressures and digital transformation. I would like to see it faster. I would like to see it more. But also we're seeing more employment coming through smaller, medium-sized businesses and more startups. So there's more opportunity for organizations to almost start from scratch in how they collaborate and how they co-opetition, but also with startups to be more intentional about what they want to set up to. So it's definitely a trend. The pace of it, we'd love to see faster.
And then, of course, that gives you more evidence.
Yes.
So I think we do where we can influence in our programs, in our culture change, in our sessions, to be really highlighting those practical ways that this can be achieved.
So where do people find out more about the work that you do, Sarah?
LinkedIn is a good place for myself, Sarah Babb, and STIM is the organization that I've co-founded that really is looking at running awareness sessions, building culture change processes for neuro-inclusion, and doing neurodiversity coaching, and that's showing a big success. So working with individuals to be self-advocating, to be building practices that work for them in the workplace, as well as building communities of support. So employee resource groups, or finding a lot of traction amongst parents of neurodivergent children seeking some support in the workplace, because it's a huge level of stress to be managing a child or young adult that is navigating this world as neurodivergent. Yeah, so that's also our events are posted on the website and linked through my LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Also looking at ways to research and share more, because there's a lot of amalgamated data, and more of an understanding now that sectors are quite different and context matters. So definitely open also for people to share if they have information or are looking to support research in particular sectors. I think that's really important. To your point, what evidence, what data do we have to also discover what practices are working or not so much to actually build these cultures that we want?
I think that's really, really interesting, especially interested in that parents of young people joining the workforce and how to support them and give them the support that they need to step into their own careers. I think that's really interesting as a community of need, and understanding how to do that. It's important that knowledge and understanding and toolkits that you're providing for people to understand how to do that is really important work, but very relevant to so many people, I think. 'Cause I mean, my children are get older and getting into their careers and thinking about their choices about what they do. But I do think my peers are all in that similar position with their kids looking, and
Yes.
it's great. It's hard enough being a parent trying to help steer your child into careers and thinking, but if you've got neurodiversity in the mix there as well, that can be extra challenging. And to think about
Yeah,
what are the best route ways into that. And I think
exactly.
that would be great for careers advice,
Yes,
Completely.
for visibility of that for careers advisors, to understand those sectors that are great
exactly.
and accepting, and the ones that are going to be,
Yeah.
actually, this is going to be a really hard place for you to put yourself, you know.
Exactly. So recruiters, counselors to be understanding what's in a neuroaffirming way, but also the way of work is changing. So for an individual to understand, they might have a portfolio approach or different options, as you say, that weren't traditionally there. So yes, we draw in a whole pool of experts, whether it's career advisors or OT or psychologists, or we had even a medical practitioner talking about medication. As you say, just practical insights. Mostly what I'm finding, Dana, is the communities really just appreciate knowing they're not alone. And I'm also
Yes.
setting up a community now of women in the workplace because of this higher diagnosis, of people realizing I've felt like this, but I'm actually not alone in this.
Yeah.
And that there are strengths. So there's such a power of belonging and feeling that there is a place where you're understood as you are, not how you've masked or been excluded for.
Yep. And also to receive the right kind of advice, because I think sometimes we go online, we search for like help, but we don't know if it's the right things that we're getting. So I think that coming from community groups and experts like yourself, and shared amongst parents or people what's really working, I think that's empowering too. I also think it's so tricky for schools and education to have the capacity to support like this. I think lots of them are still recovering from the pandemic. So actually, this window that we have are probably the children that were the most affected by time out from school and disruption to the next steps on their kind of career ladder. So it's super important there's more given to that. But most institutions are still trying to recover from the impact of the pandemic and things. So it's a real it's like a storm that we have to kind of navigate through. Here's hoping the next kind of couple of years, as things start to become a little bit more predictable in terms of how we navigate stuff, if that could ever be a thing, that it gets easier for people to find the right resources and schools and education to join those kind of communities and have capacity to do that as they come through their own kind of recovery too.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. It's very hard.
One of the questions we always ask people, Sarah, when they join Skillsminer podcast is, have you ever, so we can split it two ways. Have you ever been given a piece of absolutely golden careers advice that when you've got, from somebody who's given you a piece of super advice that you've held with you and you've carried on with that through your career? Or is there something that you would say, actually, it's not someone else gave me this, but this is the thing that I have learned, that you could share with people and make them think differently, maybe?
I'd love to share an insight that I received actually through one of my hobbies is scuba diving. And there's beautiful reefs along the southern coast of Africa and one just below or just in Mozambique. And we were scuba diving and I wanted to see dolphins. I love dolphins. And on that trip, there's great pods of dolphins that swim through. And we had our morning launch, no dolphins, afternoon launch, no dolphins. And it was spectacular, but I had it fixed in my mind that I wanted to see dolphins. Second day, launch in the morning, no dolphins, launch in the afternoon. I was getting quite desperate. Like, how is it that this is not happening? So that afternoon, we just thought, well, we're here on the ocean. It's a beautiful day. Let's just go around. There's a bay and you can go around the edge into the next bay and just see what else we can find. So we sort of took off our gear and just were on the boat and went around the corner. Next thing, there was this absolutely spectacular whale shark.
Wow.
Gosh, whale fin, and their tail is 4 meters high. Their body extends to, could be 12 feet, if not more. This gentle giant is pottering along the water. And of course, we frantically put on our flippers and our goggles again, and we're able to snorkel next to this whale shark, which is the most peaceful creature if you've ever seen them. They literally just look as if they're gliding, these gentle giants. So it was an absolute gift to have that time. And so what struck me is that there is always something else around the corner. And it really stayed with me. So I was fixated on the dolphins, but could have missed out on this beautiful opportunity of the whale shark, which was really a really life-changing moment. And so this is really with complexity, right? That there is emergence and trends that emerge, but if we fixated on one outcome, we might miss the beauty that is around us already. So how can we actually just be alert to whether it's people or an environment or a situation or an opportunity, be alert to it may look different to what we were intended, but it may even be better. And that stayed with me since then.
Well, perfect. What a lovely point to end our podcast on. That's great, Sarah. And I really appreciate you sharing that with us, actually. You're right, because your head's down all the time, aren't you? Or doing this thing or obsessing over, and you miss the other thing. You may miss the other thing if you don't give yourself space and opportunity to do that. So that's wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.
I want
What
to
a
just
lovely
talk to you
conversation.
forever. I think there's so many things. I've got all these questions. I've written down a whole page of additional questions. That's podcast number 2, I think.
Podcast 2.
Yes,
Podcast 2.
Absolutely. Thank you.
But it's been fantastic to have you, Sarah, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Skillsminer podcast. You can find more episodes and videos about Skillsminer on our YouTube channel, and you can listen to more podcasts on our Spotify. Thank you.